The Republic, as we all know, had a top-notch vehicle arsenal during the Clone Wars, which included formidable machines like the AT-TE, the AT-RT, and the Juggernaut tank. But by the time of the Galactic Civil War, the Empire's own arsenal was very different and only marginally better on the surface. So that begs the question, why did the Empire completely redo its vehicle arsenal when it had such a good one left over from the Clone Wars?
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The Republic had a wide variety of war machines at its disposal, between which its ground forces could handle a wide variety of environments and counter nearly all vehicles fielded by the Confederacy. Its most famous vehicles were its walkers, which included the universally useful AT-TE, the nimble AT-RT, the formidable AT-AP, and the flexible AT-XT. The Republic also used several models of speeder bike and some repulsive tanks as well, plus wheeled vehicles like the devastating HAV-W-A6 Juggernaut and multiple types of artillery. This team of war machines could conquer nearly anything the Clone Wars threw at it. The Republic had light vehicles for reconnaissance or to outflank enemy forces, larger, heavily armored behemoths for wide-scale destructive efforts, and a few vehicles in between like the AT-TE. These vehicles all proved their worth on the battlefields of the Clone Wars, and the Republic never faced any real problems in the vehicle department aside from numbers. That said, it only took a few years after the end of the Clone Wars for most of these vehicles to be phased out. Not many models were fully retired, mind you. Most Clone Wars era vehicle models served the Empire in some sort of support role or on backwater Outer Rim worlds, though most of them were rarely used in frontline combat on all but the most remote Imperial holdings. A few notable vehicles did continue to see widespread use, but they were few and far between. Most of the vehicles fully retained by the Empire were late war developments like the AT-PT. Some other light vehicle models, like the ubiquitous 74Z speeder bike, was also retained, but for the most part, the Republic's heavy vehicles were almost entirely phased out. The only major exception to this rule was the HAV-W-A6 Juggernaut, which had been the heaviest vehicle in the Republic's arsenal. The Juggernaut wasn't used by the Empire nearly as much as it was used by the Republic, but it was still prominent enough by the time of the Galactic Civil War to see use in the Battle of Hoth. The Empire's vehicle arsenal was much smaller and on average lighter than the Republic's vehicles had been. The most notable new additions were upgraded TX-120T fighter tanks, versatile AT-STs, and the towering, powerful AT-AT. The AT-AT indeed was more powerful than anything the Republic had used during the Clone Wars, and its heavy armor and powerful weapons were both Clone Wars era design techniques, which makes sense as prototype versions of the towering walkers did indeed see action during the Clone Wars on Jabim and Nemoidia. The other new additions, however, were seemingly a step down from Clone Wars era counterparts, with lighter weapons and sometimes even lighter armor. There are actually several reasons for this, with most of them relating to the tactics and differences between the Clone Wars and Galactic Civil War. To understand these reasons, we first need to take another look at the bigger picture. The Clone Wars was very much a traditional conflict. It consisted of two powers using relatively conventional methods to capture planets across the galaxy. Ground battles were massive, consuming huge armies of infantry backed with plenty of vehicles of all forms. Most vehicle types were of use in such battles, and the general rule for them was the more damage they could deal, the better, even for speeders and lighter vehicles. For the heavier vehicles, this was intensified, as the capability to destroy more of your enemies in one shot than your enemies could destroy your allies was of the utmost usefulness. The Republic's vehicle arsenal was tailor-made for this kind of conflict, obviously. Staples of Republic task forces like the AT-TE, Bark Speeder, and the Juggernaut were much more heavily armed than other vehicles of their respective sizes, intended to devastate large numbers of enemies at once. They were also designed to be materially efficient. The Republic crammed as much firepower as they could into individual vehicles to save materials, which the Republic was constantly having shortages of. The Galactic Civil War was much different from the Clone Wars, which in part was the reason why the Empire lost. While their vehicles were made for the new conflict, their officers were used to a different type of war. In the Galactic Civil War, the Empire was fighting against small insurgent cells who used guerrilla tactics and didn't really fight any traditional ground battles if they could help it. The rebels used few armored vehicles, and those that they did use were light and maneuverable. With or without vehicles, the rebels usually fought ground battles from deep cover, forcing infantry to come in after them and rendering heavy vehicles almost useless. Just as the Republic vehicle arsenal was born of the nature of the Clone Wars, the Imperial vehicle arsenal was born of the nature of the Galactic Civil War. Imperial vehicles, with the notable exception of the AT-AT, were designed for anti-personnel use on worlds that were at least part friendly. This is why most new Imperial vehicles are lighter than their Clone Wars counterparts, and it's also why most Republic counterparts wouldn't have worked very well. The Empire required more precision and less firepower. Furthermore, the Empire didn't have the material shortages that the Republic had, which meant that it could opt to spread out firepower among its vehicles, making individual units cheaper. This is why even the Empire's heavy vehicles like the AT-AT have less firepower than Clone Wars era vehicles, even though it might have been useful. The Empire was opting to use more of them for the same effects. This meant that taking down one vehicle wouldn't cripple an assault nearly as much, and it also meant that rebels couldn't hijack one vehicle and devastate the rest of the assault force. Imperial use of vehicles was mostly geared toward flushing out entrenched groups of infantry as opposed to countering other vehicles or large armies. This is why, for example, the AT-ST was used by the Empire instead of the Republic AT-XT, which was about the same size but with heavier weapons. Unlike the AT-XT, the AT-ST could devastate groups of enemy infantry without much collateral damage, and it could easily maneuver through forests or cramped streets. Tactics were simply different between the two conflicts, and in the ground vehicle department, the Empire was just adapting to the times, which, it should be said, was actually pretty rare for the Imperial military. For the most part, the Empire's vehicles fell into three categories: light recon vehicles, medium all-purpose vehicles, and heavy vehicles, exemplified by the 74Z speeder bike, the AT-ST, and the AT-AT respectively. The medium vehicle category mostly filled the role we just described. They were intended to flush out cells of hostiles, though they could take out enemy vehicles if need be. They could also serve rather well on a traditional battlefield in most cases, especially with the TX-120T fighter tank. The light vehicle category mostly consisted of speeders and AT-PTs for the Empire, and it was in this category where the Empire overlapped most with the Republic. Speeders are speeders, and though the Republic's heavily armed BARC speeders and ISPs were phased out, their general purpose 74Zs weren't, and they saw use effectively the same way. Between them and the medium vehicles, other light vehicles were rarely used by the Empire, though AT-PTs were used occasionally when vehicles on the level of the AT-RT were necessary. The heavy vehicle category, which was dominated by the AT-AT, mostly followed the same set of rules it did during the Clone Wars, but for a different reason. The Empire rarely faced anything that actually needed a heavy vehicle to counter, and they instead used heavy vehicles for something completely different: fear. Per the Tarkin doctrine, Imperial heavy vehicles were designed to terrify, being capable of taking lots of damage, dealing impressive displays of destruction in return, and casting long shadows over the ranks of enemies. The AT-AT exemplifies this, as even though they were objectively less powerful than some of the Republic vehicles, they were undeniably more terrifying, and that's what the Empire was really looking for. As stated earlier, unlike with the Republic, the Empire didn't really have any vehicle threats to counter. The Republic was faced with an enemy that had a ton of dangerous war machines at its disposal, from spider droids to AATs to tank droids. These vehicles were top of the line and mostly brand new, and they all posed a significant threat to Republic infantry forces. Most of its larger, more powerful vehicles were designed to counter them as a result, and they did so with respectable effectiveness. The Empire had no such threats. After the reconquest of the Rim, all the Empire was fighting was rebel cells, at first scattered and eventually only slightly more organized. Nearly all of the vehicles that the rebels used were leftovers from the Clone Wars, old models used either by the CIS or the Republic. These decaying old machines were only occasionally paired with newer, more dangerous light tanks, and most of the time neither amounted to a threat to even basic Imperial vehicle columns. With all of these factors considered, it's easy to see why most of the Republic's vehicle models were discontinued after the Clone Wars. But there are still a few, like the AT-RT, that could still have been useful. But there's a reason that they were replaced too, and it's rather simple. Many later Imperial models were upgrades of older Republic concepts, which outclassed their predecessors to enough of a degree that the Republic models became obsolete. Because of this, the AT-RT was replaced with the AT-PT, the TX-120S was replaced with the TX-120T, and the AT-XT was replaced with the AT-ST. Well guys, that's our thoughts on why so many Republic vehicles were phased out by the Empire. But as per usual, I want to know what you think. Do you agree with our assessment? Let me know in the comments section below. And just before you go, make sure you check out all the links in the description below to join the wider Geetsly's community on our GGN and on our Discord. And also, if you want to help support me further than watching this video, do check out our Patreon as well. That link is also in the description. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.